And we are live.
We are live. We are Broadcast Team Alpha, bringing you cutting edge conversations while exploring the quantum possibilities. And we have an amazing guest tonight. Aage actually went galactic on a mission, so he's not going to be with us tonight. He's going to be checking in from outer space. I am graced by my co host, Tom. And I just want to tell you a little bit about our guest. Our guest is a leading UFO researcher. She's the author of several books. She's a featured on camera expert and an international lecturer. Kathleen Marden earned a BA degree in social work, and she worked as an educator and in educational services. She was a coordinator while she attended graduate school. Kathleen is a practitioner of regression and QHHT hypnosis, which is close to my heart. And her interest in UFOs began in 1961 when, you're going to recognize these names, when her aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had a close encounter and subsequent abduction in the New Hampshire White Mountains. Kathleen received MUFON's Director of Experiencer Research Award for extraterrestrial excellence, or UFO excellence. I'm pulling from another page. And she has lots of great books that you can see. And I just want to welcome Kathleen, because we were talking before we came live, and there's so much to talk about. Kathleen, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be with you.
This is so exciting. So I just don't even know where to start. I mean, I want to go to the juicy part that you told me about, but how about just giving our listeners a little background so they can begin to know you, as I have, in my research?
Okay, well, I was 13 years old when my aunt and uncle returned home from a short vacation trip to Niagara Falls and then Montreal. And my aunt had phoned my mother, and I was home from school in the afternoon. And my aunt was very, very concerned because she and my uncle had had a close encounter with what she called then a flying saucer in New Hampshire's White Mountains the evening before that. And I was immediately very, very interested in what happened. I saw what played out in the investigation. I had the chance to meet most of the early on investigators. I even went to NICAP headquarters with Betty and Barney when we went to Washington, D.C. We were invited guests at Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. So, I mean, it's been a very, very long history of interest in UFOs. And of course, I had my professional career, but this is my love. This is, Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss.
Yes.
And about 30 years ago, I decided to do that. And I've been working pretty much full time in this field since that time.
This is amazing. And I love your professional background because, there's so many naysayers. So I feel like, with your background in social work and education, I think it lends, what would the word be? More, I don't know, more dependability to the people who are skeptical, because you're not just somebody who got picked up, off the beach by a spacecraft and you're coming to tell your story. I mean, you have your professional life, and then you have what you experienced, and then what you've done in all of your research, and you've had an experience of your own. So, somebody asked me earlier about the clothing that Betty and Barney had on during their experience, and was it ever tested for frequency, or was it ever tested in some way that would be meaningful or reveal something more than we know now?
Well, let me talk about Betty's dress first.
Yes.
Because I'll give you a little background on that. It was a fairly new dress. It was her favorite blue dress.
Mm-hmm.
And she was wearing it on the trip and had worn it one day before that. and it was in perfectly fine condition when she put it on the morning of September 19, 1961. But when she arrived home the following morning, something had happened. And her dress was torn in several places. There was a zipper running up the back of her dress, and there was a 2-inch tear in the stitching along the top of the zipper, and then there was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric right next to the metal teeth of that zipper. Also, the hem was down on one side of her dress, and the dress was torn from waist to hemline in the lining. So that dress has been analyzed in 6 different laboratories over a period of many years. The University of Cincinnati chemistry department were the first ones to analyze that dress. The reason for that was that Betty put the dress in her closet, and the next time she took it out, it was coated with a pink powdery substance. She put the dress on the clothesline, the pink powder flew away, but she was going to throw it out. She decided she'd better keep it because it might hold a clue to what happened to the dress that night and what happened to Betty that night. Wow. So during the analysis, the University of Cincinnati did many, many different tests to try to create that discoloration, because not all of the dress was discolored. Parts of it remained the original color. Mm-hmm. And what they discovered was that it was strange that this substance, whatever it was, could not be reproduced using any chemical they put on that dress. And the elemental compound, the substance that was on that dress, was strange in relationship to anything else on that dress.
Wow.
That was, and every single one of those 6 scientific examinations of that dress ended up with an explanation that something was anomalous. They couldn't identify a substance that came from outer space. Who knows what that would look like? Probably like what we have here. Yes. But what they did know is that something had happened to Betty, something had happened to that dress, and there was evidence on that dress that something had happened. There's been speculation. We know that that pink powdery substance fluoresced under a black light. We see that fluorescence on the bodies of experiencers time and time again. And so there are special properties and knowledge that we have about fluorescence. And one scientist who took a look at that dress speculated that perhaps it was a form of yeast. The speculation was that maybe Betty's dress was sterilized.
Wow.
Before she went on the craft, or immediately after she went on to the craft. And perhaps that sterilization process had killed off all of the bacteria. And when you kill that bacteria, yeast can flourish. So the speculation was that this yeast was on these non-human entities' hands, and they transferred it to her dress. And we found that the dress was most heavily saturated with that pink substance in the areas where Betty remembered being touched by them.
Wow.
So, that's speculation, but
phenomenal.
It's a pretty good coincidence.
I heard a comment from another researcher that said, I think it was Peter Robbins, where he was talking about it's the old cases before technology could kind of pollute the discussion that have a lot of the value. And so you are one of the pioneers in ufology. You're an icon, along with, not to diminish your role at all, but your peers are people like Stanton Friedman and those kinds of individuals. You guys were doing the research when there was no cell phones. There was on foot digging through records and archives and that kind of stuff and old photographs. How do you feel about what the state of ufology has kind of evolved? It's constantly evolving, but are people aware of some of the veracity of some of these older stories that can't be easily disproven because of a CGI or something of that nature? There's a lot of veracity to that whole story that is difficult to dismiss.
Yes, there is, and you know there's a famous case, the Delphos case, that took place where there was a teenage boy, and he was out feeding the farm animals, and he this was before dinner at night, and his parents were in the home preparing dinner. He was out with his dog when a UFO came in and hovered over the ground by a nearby tree. And he and his dog were just frozen into place.
Wow.
And they watched this craft, you know, hiding sort of behind a tree until it left. And then he went into the house. His parents were already eating, wondering why he was so late. But he told them what happened. And they went outside. And there was physical trace evidence on the ground. The craft was close enough to the ground so that to leave physical trace evidence.
Wow.
That evidence was collected. And a man named Ted Phillips, who was one of the early pioneers, collected more than 4,000 pieces of physical trace evidence. Not all of them were analyzed, but many of the compelling ones were analyzed. So we have that kind of scientific analysis. Stanton Friedman went out to that spot and actually collected samples. And for anyone who doesn't know, Stan and I worked together for many years. We wrote 3 books together. And so Stanton had 2 paper plates, and one of the paper plates had this like hard, chunky soil that was impermeable, and then the other one was like normal soil. So you saw the soil inside the circle where that UFO hovered, and then the soil outside where it hovered. And so there was a substance that grew, that appeared there almost immediately, because the mother of this boy touched that substance, and her hand became numb. She rubbed it on her leg, and her leg became numb.
Oh
Other
my.
people who touched it had that same sensation.
It was
And
something that was on the ground that was left behind by these
yes,
ET
yeah, you
craft.
could see, if you look it up online, you will be able to see kind of like a white powdery substance on the ground. The debunkers tested it and said it was only fungus. There have been really good scientific investigations of this. Phyllis Budinger did one of those. She was the scientist who did the chemical analysis, one of the analyses on my aunt's dress. And she found unusual properties in that substance, and fluorescence was one of them. There was another scientist from England who actually has a PhD, works for a pharmaceutical company, and he did an analysis on that too. And his findings were so compelling that he wrote a report on this. He had been published in scientific journals.
Wow.
So he sent, in peer-reviewed journals, so he sent his report in, indicating this highly unusual information that he had discovered, and they rejected his reports. He sent them in again and again, and he started arguing, why won't you allow this to be peer-reviewed?
Yeah.
And the answers that he received in the end, after attempting this time after time, was we do not publish anything about UFOs.
Wow.
Go to a UFO journal if you want that published.
Isn't
And
it interesting? You mentioned that could have been, the debunkers said that it could have been a fungus.
Yeah.
What if they were right that it was a fungus, and maybe that's what the ETs were intending?
Could be, but they said it was a common fungus that grew on a certain type of land.
Of course.
Why wasn't it there before that craft hovered above the
Coincidence?
ground? Why was it there only afterward?
You know, you mentioned something else too earlier, that you'd worked with Stanton Friedman. I bet he is happy to find out NASA just announced that they were going to start using nuclear rockets again.
Is that so?
So he should be excited about that. That was something that I know that he had worked on. So, yeah.
I'll have to tell him that. I spoke to him on the phone this afternoon. We still talk about once a week, even though he's retired. And next time I talk to him, I'll let him know.
Yeah, I listened to an entire interview where he talked about that, and it was fascinating. So definitely.
Stanton talked about it?
Oh, yeah, he outlined his whole career in nuclear rocket engineering. It was amazing. I didn't mean to sidetrack too much on that, but I knew that you two had worked together. And
Yes.
yeah, so.
So Kathleen, I'm still on the dress. That the lining was ripped. I'm wondering, that sounds to me, right? The nurse in me is going, that sounds like struggle. Do you
I
know?
can tell you how it was ripped.
You can tell me.
I can tell you because under hypnosis, Betty relived that.
Wow.
And she was terrified. She tried to escape when these non-human entities were approaching the car. She opened the car door and she was going to run and hide in the woods, but they intercepted her before she was able to. They pointed something at her and she became unconscious.
Yeah.
And she woke up again as she was being taken down a pathway in the woods to a clearing, and the craft was on the ground in this clearing. They attempted to take her up a ramp onto this craft, and she fought for her life. She didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't know if she was going to be, taken to a planet and put in a zoo or used as a specimen, or what was going to happen. They kept reassuring her, "You'll be okay. We only want to do a few simple tests." But she really didn't trust their words. So when she woke up, she gave the escort on one side, I think it was the right side, a good kick and tried to escape. And then they, pointed that at her and regained control of her again and took her up this ramp and into an examining room.
Wow. So hypnotherapy wise, did the regression, was it helpful in that Betty wanted to remember what happened, or was it more helpful in helping her to, mitigate the emotions or the unknown aspects of it that may have troubled her? We see that in a lot of interviews with experiencers, how an experience like that doesn't fit in with life. The people at church think you're weird. Your husband might think you're weird now. So I was just wondering how that may have benefited her.
Yes. Betty was not the primary patient. My Uncle Barney was, because he was the one who suffered the greatest trauma from this experience. He was the one who had the conscious recall of observing these non-human entities and feeling threatened, feeling afraid he was going to be captured. Betty didn't have that experience. She was seated in the car and the interior light was left on. Barney left his door open when he got out of the car to look at this craft through binoculars when it was hovering only about 100 feet above him. So, Betty did not have conscious, continuous recall of the road block and what happened there. She remembered encountering a roadblock somewhere along the way, but she didn't know where or when. She remembered observing like a fiery orb on the ground, but she didn't know where or when that was. It was always very mysterious and perplexing to her. Betty was a woman who was very brave. She was a social worker too.
Yay.
And she was fearless. She always told the story about how, as a social worker, one of her foster children had run off and was in a motel room with two men who had escaped from prison. One of them was her boyfriend. And the police were there, and the hotel was surrounded. And Betty went up, knocked on the door, said to the girl, "Get out here right now. I'm going to take you home to your parents, foster parents." And the girl actually came out.
Wow.
You know, I don't know if you call that poor judgment or what, but Betty was very brave, and she took that girl, and she was always a fighter for what was right. She was a very brave woman. She had a lot of curiosity about what had happened to her, but not the level of anxiety about it or the level of trauma that Barney had. And after the hypnosis sessions, I want to tell you that she and Barney had separate hypnosis sessions, and Dr. Simon reinforced amnesia at the end of each session so that they couldn't share information or remember what they said. And so at the end, Dr. Simon told Betty that she did have a lot of emotional working through to do. And I have all of those hypnosis tapes. I listened to them over and over again, sometimes weeping through them, because, I was very close to my aunt and uncle. And I transcribed them for comparative analysis. That was part of the work that I did in the research I did for my book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And Stanton Friedman joined me by vetting my work and writing a couple of chapters in my book. And so what I discovered is that in the end, their statements lined up. Betty always gave a more detailed explanation of everything, much more descriptive than Barney through the entire trip. And Dr. Simon didn't just take them to the point of the sighting or the point of the abduction. He began at the beginning of their trip and took them through their entire trip to see how they describe things, how they were feeling on this trip, if they were experiencing anxiety about being an interracially married couple back in 1961, and anything that happened on the trip that could have led to them believing an experience had happened when it had not.
Yeah.
So as a neuropsychiatrist, he really covered every aspect of this. But what I discovered is that Betty also had a series of dreams. She had 5 in all. They occurred starting about 10 days after she had this experience. And she had them just before she woke up in the morning, those kind of hypnopompic dreams that you have that can, if it reflects a real event, it can seem too real to have been a dream. Those were the kinds of dreams she had. And she wrote them down, and Barney was working the midnight shift at the post office. So she was sleeping alone at night, and then she'd go to her job as a social worker during the day. But she wrote those dreams down, and she took them to her supervisor at the welfare department. And her supervisor said, perhaps this reflects a real event in your life. Maybe that's a clue to what happened to you during that time, 2 or 3 hours of missing time, lost time that couldn't be explained given any conventional explanation. And so that was, I wanted to compare the information in Betty's dreams to the information that Betty and Barney produced separately as a result of their hypnosis. And what I discovered was that Betty and Barney told exactly the same story from their point of view all the way through the entire trip.
Wow.
And I ended up in the end taking the same driving route that Betty and Barney took. I retraced the entire trip with my husband and took that driving route too. And based upon their descriptions, I knew exactly where they were all along that long trip that they took. And in the end, their statements matched. Now, what I had to do is compare those statements to Betty's dream information. And I found discrepancies between what Betty had written in her dreams, about her dreams, and what she and Barney recalled under hypnosis. So they were recalling the same thing, but it wasn't always in Betty's dream material. Sometimes it contradicted her dreams, which is typical of dreams.
Right. Fascinating. There's so many questions I want to ask, but I just want to say, for people who are just joining us, we are having an amazing conversation with Kathleen Marden, leading UFO researcher, author of many books, Captured, The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, Science Was Wrong, Fact, Fiction, and the Experiencer's Handbook, Beyond UFOs. Let's see that. The Science of Consciousness and Contact with Non-Human Intelligence. You can find all the books and information at Kathleen, that's with 2 E's, Marden, MARDEN.com. So I love that Betty was a social worker, right? And a feisty social worker. So that leads me to ask, do you think that they choose who they're going to experience, if you will, who they're going to study, for certain human qualities, or maybe not human qualities?
Well, based upon what they have told experiencers, they said that initially they just took samples. They took, people driving in cars, people out hiking, people fishing, farm kids in upstate New York, for example. So they took a lot of different individuals in the beginning, but then they identified those who had the characteristics that they would want to see take over this Earth if we ended up destroying our planet.
Wow.
And they reseeded this planet. That's what they have told individuals and several individuals I've worked with. And of course, Free did a study, the Free's Experiencer Questionnaire. I also did a study with Dr. Don C. Don Derry through MUFON's Experiencer research team, of which I'm the director. And Dr. Don Derry is a retired professor of psychology at McGill University and statistician. He spent his life doing social research.
Now,
so both of these studies I worked on, Freeze and MUFON's.
You mentioned Free. I'm sorry to cut in a little bit. I want to catch that at that moment. Maybe explain to people what Free is all about and that questionnaire, because I remember hearing you speak about this recently. So maybe give people a little bit more insight on what Free is all about.
Sure. Well, Free is the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters. Edgar Mitchell was one of the founders of the organization, and it was founded by Ray Hernandez, who was a Miami lawyer who had an extraordinary experience in his living room where his little dog was at death's door. He and his wife were going to have to put the dog down the next day when they had this period of missing time. His wife had been praying and praying and praying. They had this period of missing time. And when they all came back together, the dog was absolutely fine, running around the living room, jumping in the air, feeling great. He thought, there's something here. There's something that I need to learn more about. And he initially thought, well, maybe it is a UFO experience. And so he asked me to come on early on in this organization. Mary Rodwell, the Australian researcher, is one of the founding members of FREE. I came on a little bit later because I was already involved in MUFON. I was, at that time that he was doing the original founding, I was also working on my own initial research project on experiencers. So FREE did a very large research project over several years, and ended up having PhDs who came in, academics who, spent their life in social research, and they did just an extraordinary job. It's mind-boggling the amount of evidence that they were able to collect from these about 4,000
These were some online questionnaires, right? That people were
Yes, it was on.
experiencers, abductees, and then you had filters to kind of define what the different levels of a contact that they had. Is that how that worked?
That was on my study.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
That was on mine with MUFON. FREE wasn't really dividing the experiencers up the way we did. It didn't have psychometric part of it the way we did at MUFON, and Dr. Don Derry administered the American Personality Inventory. That was part of MUFON's study. But on FREE's study, they had just an extraordinary amount of questionnaires, many different phases that they would go through to get more information about specific areas, more information, for example, about the paranormal, more for all of those who had experienced that.
So was that information then compiled into reports, or is it available somewhere online? Can people look at that?
FREE's information was published in a scientific journal pertaining to consciousness. Yeah, I'd have to look it up. I have the book here. You can also buy the book, and it's available at Amazon. It's Beyond UFOs: The Science of Consciousness and Contact with Non-Human Intelligence. I have a chapter, a 30,000 word chapter in that book. And FREE's research is all discussed by the scientists who were in charge of analyzing the data. You'll learn a lot about that study. They looked at very specific areas. The hybridization program, what people thought about that, what information they could contribute about that, their attitudes toward their experience, and what types of entities they interacted with, and was that interaction physical or non-physical. There were a number of different ways that FREE looked at all of this data. So it was an incredible study. Ray Hernandez speaks Spanish fluently, and so he came up with the idea that that study should be repeated in countries around the world. And so I think it's still in progress now in Spanish. Wow. And then he was going to try to have it done in French and maybe Japanese or Chinese. I'm not positive about that, but I know there was some discussion about that as well.
Can you imagine all the data they would have collected from people in Mexico because of all the huge number of sightings there?
Yes, Mexico, Central America, South America.
And I love that it's going worldwide,
Yes.
because I think there are so many, I'm just guessing, I think there are so many people out there who are afraid to speak up, right? They're afraid somebody's going to slap a psychiatric diagnosis on them if they speak up. And the thing that I noticed from the interviews that we've done with experiencers is that all of the experiencers that we've interviewed are really nice people. I mean, they're really, I would say, of course they would want to, to interview you, or or test you. I mean, they're just really, really nice people. If I suspected that I've had an experience and I can't remember it, what are the signs and symptoms or hints that I might look at in my life or me that could help me to uncover that, besides having a QHHT session with you, which would be amazing?
I always want to make sure that people have some conscious recall of an experience. The evidence indicates that the majority of experiencers have had a close encounter with UFOs. The majority have family members who have also had a close encounter, and also have parents who are experiencers as well.
Yes.
So many, I don't know the percentage of experiencers who have conscious recall of at least part of their experience, but I would suspect that the percentage is fairly high based upon the people that I have worked with personally. So if somebody says to me, how can I know? What should I look for? The first thing I suggest is, when you wake up having these dreams that seem too real to have been dreams, immediately write down everything you remember, because it can eventually just fade from your memory. But if you have a journal, then you'll be able to refer back to that journal and it will give you information. So write down the date and everything you remember, all of those details. Inspect your body. Do you have any unusual new marks on your body? And I'm not just talking about a little bump or bruise. I'm talking about finger marks
Mhm.
on that are black and blue
Yes.
on your body.
Yes.
There are also other marks that I don't let the public know about, but
Yes.
there are certain marks that show up time and time again on
Interesting.
experiencers. I also recommend to people that they could try to capture something on a game camera,
Ah.
infrared action mode, motion activated
Yeah.
game camera in their bedroom, and you're not going to see UFOs or aliens in your bedroom. What you will see is, and I've seen this, is the say it's a married couple. There is a light shining into their home. They're seated up. They're seated on the bed. Might be back to back, one taking the window, one taking the door, knowing that something is going to happen.
Wow.
And suddenly the camera cuts out for a little over 2 hours.
Wow.
And then you find them in a completely different position than they were in. They're slipped, they might be in the process of being slipped back onto those covers, or they're under those covers lying down. That doesn't happen on a game camera. You should be
Amazing.
able to uh, get frame after frame with the time and the date. You could also use a more sophisticated surveillance camera
Mhm.
in infrared, but that again, it gets shut down. And
Yes.
so your evidence is actually a very strange kind of evidence. You might call it a lack of evidence, but it's evidence that the camera was shut down and that these two individuals were expecting something to happen. And then the camera is shut down and they're lying in bed.
Amazing.
Just a quick note here. We actually have somebody in the chat room right now that has mentioned that they had he says, me and my 3 other brothers, we being abducted. And so this guy said he was like a bad dream, but with a mark on my body. And so is there anything you can say to this person? His name is Ka No. And
Can you tell me describe the mark for me, and describe the memory? If he can't do that now, I can give him advice on what to do.
okay. Can he get that kind of information from your website?
No, I don't think so. What I want him to know is that he can go to MUFON.com, MUFON.com.
Okay.
When he gets onto the home page, he can scroll down to Experiencer Research Team. Click on that, and that will take you to the Experiencer Research page. At the top of that page, it says complete the Experiencer questionnaire. Click on that, read the instructions, and then fill out the 30 questions. That will get him a conversation with one of the specialists on my team. And I have now 31 people on our team. 4 of them are psychologists who we use as consultants. The others are speaking with experiencers, volunteering to speak on a non-judgmental basis, just to help experiencers out, to help them to come to terms with what it is. We have a list of vetted therapists that they can enter into a private relationship with. We don't have free services. These are people who are vetted, who are credentialed, who have offices where you can set up an appointment. And we also have a list of support groups.
And this is all through the MUFON website that they can drill down and get to these resources.
They have to complete the Experiencer questionnaire,
okay,
and talk to someone on my team, the Experiencer Research Team, on MUFON's website.
Excellent. So hopefully that'll help this guy out. He did
Yeah,
a thumbs up in the chat, so that's great.
Tell him, don't go to the part that says report a UFO. Go to the Experiencer Research Team. He has to scroll down.
Experiencer Research Team. Okay, great. So Ka, if you can hear what Kathleen has been telling us, to go to the MUFON website and go to the Experiencer Research Team. And they have people that are volunteering to help folks like yourself. And it's not all volunteer, but there are people there that can give you resources and some direction on what to do next. So
So Kathleen and I were talking before the show about her path, because as a nurse, I love social workers, so I had to go there. And Kathleen, you mentioned that you had a bout of fatigue and some immune things that went on, and that led you to tell me more. Do you feel like talking about that?
Sure, I don't mind talking about that.
Thank you.
You know, I had a career first in social work, and then I went into the field of education. I worked as a teacher and as an education services coordinator. And then I was suddenly struck down in about the late 1980s. And I don't know what caused this. I do know that asbestos was being removed from my school. And I do know that all of the teachers on my wing ended up becoming ill. 2 of us became disabled and were diagnosed with chronic fatigue and immune dysfunction syndrome in that time frame. Well, I could no longer work because of that. I ended up just listening to Joseph Campbell on a television show, and he said, follow your bliss. And I thought, you know, I'm going to do that. I'm going to accept my limitations and do what I've always wanted to do. And that is investigate my aunt and uncle's experience. And so I set out to do that and to write my first book. It took me about 15 years to finish writing it because there was a tremendous amount of research to do, and I was limited by my health
Yes.
because my illness would wax and wane. And then after that book was published, I started speaking nationally. And every time I would go to a conference, I would just be dying to get to my room to go to bed. And by the time the conference was over, I was ill. I would go home and spend a week in bed. But then Denise Stoner and I, who is my co author on the alien abduction files, uh, did a study in 2012. And one of the participants in that study was a man from Australia. And we connected and we started talking, and he said, well, Kathleen, your focus seems to be on abductions. He said, there's a lot more to this than abductions. And so I thought, well, I am always a person who has a thirst for knowledge. So let's see what I can learn from him. And he said, I communicate with a non-human entity, a little gray named Keek, who is part of a council of non-humans. And if you would like, I will set up an appointment so that you can speak with him. And so I said, yes, I would like to speak and ask questions. Well, I didn't see Keek on the screen. I saw Paul on the screen, and he was channeling Keek. He said it wasn't really channeling, that it was like dual conscious physical communication, that he was repeating what Keek was information Keek was giving to him. And so I thought, well, how can I test this? How can I know if this is real? What I think I'll do is to tell Keek that I've been ill for many years and I want to talk about this. I go out and talk to people, and I'd like to tell his information as well. And if he would only be able to heal me, I would be able to do a much better job at this. And so I really wasn't expecting any success out of this. But 4 nights later, I awakened during the night with terrible pain in my body. In fact, I think I woke my husband up. I can't say for certain. I was thinking, I didn't know if I was dying, if I was having a heart attack, if I needed to call 911. And I thought, well, I'll just lie here and see what happens. And the next thing I knew, I was in a new environment. I was on, I don't know if it was a craft. There were white walls. Everything was kind of rounded. There were 2 non-human entities standing on each side of me. And I could feel this electrical tingling sensation passing through my body. And then they were able to show me some kind of image. And today, I don't know if that image was implanted in my mind or if it was a holographic image or what it was. But I saw the outline of what I thought was my body. And the affected areas were highlighted in different pastel colors. And I was actually able to see like these little circles running through the periphery of my body. And they were showing me what they were doing to me, I think. I talked to a medical doctor after this, and this medical doctor has my records showing that I did have chronic fatigue syndrome, a formal medical diagnosis. I was treated for it. And then suddenly, after that day, I was perfectly healthy and well and have never had a relapse. I woke up the next morning, if that's what it was, is truly waking up or just being returned. But I felt like I was 20 years old again, or 25. I didn't have any pain in my body.
That's awesome.
I had loads of energy. It was just terrific. And since that happened, I've been able to really do a tremendous amount of work in this field to move it ahead. So I'm very, very grateful to that kind little gray and to that experiencer Paul in Australia.
Where do you see ufology at right now? What's kind of maybe a status? Where do you see the state of ufology, how it's evolved?
Well, I think that more people like myself uh, have all of the evidence we need that to know that this is real. We've been collecting that evidence, scientific evidence, for years and years and years. Some of those people still want to continue to collect that evidence in hope that scientists will actually take it seriously. From my experience and all the research I've done, and I wrote about this in my book with Stanton Friedman, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. We did archival research, and in those correspondence files, it became quite obvious, which we already knew anyway, that it was taboo to science, that scientists had no interest in scientific evidence of UFOs. So those of us
Kathleen, I'm sorry. Do you think it was maybe not interest, or were they being dissuaded because of heavy pressure? Maybe the academics were all being.
They were absolutely being dissuaded. There was actually a group put together after the Condon Committee. Edward Condon was involved. The notorious debunker, disinformant Philip Klass was involved, and a few other scientists. But there was a petition that was sent out. I have it in my files. A petition that was sent out asking scientists not to speak about UFOs, not to appear on any panels in reference to UFOs, and to call those scientists who actually did have an interest in this charlatans, and to threaten any scientist, academic scientist, who was interested in the investigation of UFOs to lose their job, or to simply not advance in their careers. And I can give you an example of an academic scientist that this happened to. This was Philip Klass's main target during back in the Condon days, back in the late 60s. And his name was Dr. James McDonald. He started out as the chairman of the physics department at the University of Arizona, and he developed an interest in UFOs, and he started to study these UFOs. And so he then became co-chair of the department to give himself time for this. He studied UFOs for 10 years using math, and he had grants through the Office of Naval Research. He was closely connected with the Office of Naval Research, and he would do cloud studies in different countries, and in this country too. He was a meteorological physicist. And so one time he went to Australia to do one of these studies. And in his spare time, when he wasn't working, he would investigate UFOs. Well, what Philip Klass did to him was plant a story in a Washington, D.C. newspaper stating that Dr. McDonald had misused public funding and had actually been investigating UFOs with public funding when he went on that trip to Australia. Dr. McDonald became the target of a federal investigation about what happened. He was exonerated, but what the public and everyone else knew was this lie that Philip Klass had given to this newspaper reporter. And Philip Klass was one of the editors of a scientific journal in Washington, D.C. So, he was respected public didn't know that he was actually a disinformant. And he and Donald Menzel, another disinformant, Dr. Donald Menzel from Harvard University, worked very closely together. Dr. Menzel didn't much bother to even look at the evidence. Philip Klass went further at looking at the evidence, and whenever there was a highly credible individual, Philip Klass would do the best job he could to destroy that person and that person's career. I have a lecture where I actually show evidence of this.
Wow.
But that evidence is also in my book with Stan Friedman, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. It's my latest book. And, the long story made short, Dr. McDonald, James McDonald, had a very tragic end. He lost the respect of other people in his field. Mm-hmm. He was laughed at as a result of what Philip Klass did to him. And in the end, his wife left him too. He attempted suicide. He failed, but he ended up completing the job a little bit later.
Wow, that is so sad.
It is
so sad.
Terribly sad, because he was the leading scientist of all time in the scientific investigation of UFOs, as far as I'm concerned.
So this helped to bring, it was another muzzling effect on scientific inquiry into all of it, the contact, the aerial phenomena, all of it.
Yes, absolutely. And it was an orchestrated plan to dissuade scientists from taking this seriously, from doing a scientific investigation of the evidence.
I appreciate your truth. I appreciate you speaking out. And I'm so going to read your books. I just wanted to circle back a little bit to the person who had an experience. He said that he had triangle marks, pyramid-shaped marks, and he believed that they took samples of his genetic DNA 3 and 4 times in his life. He was about 6 to 7 years old. He was in Japan. Now he's 34 years old, and he lives in Canada. So I know there are things you don't want to just reveal to the public about marks.
Triangle marks are pretty well known. Some people think that means like 3 needle points in a triangle. That's the thing that's most convincing to me, is when an actual piece of skin is sort of like cut out, almost like a punch cut, in a certain area of the body.
Like a biopsy.
Yeah, he says he's got marks, and he also sees a green light, missing time, a lot of the classic remarks that we've all heard of. So he says he has marks on his body and a bad dream.
Mm-hmm. And we have people on the experiencer research team who live in Canada. We have 3 members in Canada. There are also hypnotherapists in Canada, and we can refer him to an online support group. It's in the United States. I'm not aware of any in Canada at this time, but if he wants to be in a group where he would be talking with other experiencers. And it really does a lot of good for people to be able to compare notes with others. You know, at one time, I was terrified about my memories of being taken. And, you know, was reading books about this at the time. And I think the more I read, the more terrified I became. And then over time, the more I learned, the more I realized that it wasn't that bad. And now I haven't been taken in a few years as far as I know, but the way I look at it is, so what? They wanted me for an hour or 2 a year? out of a whole lifetime, what does that matter? I know people have experiences more often, generally during the reproductive years. But I think that if something good is going to come from this, then it was worth doing.
Well, it's like someone said that abductees and experiencers are really the evidence of ET contact. That's where it really, that's the
Yes.
connection. Yeah.
Yes, those who have been verified as having had this type of experience with all of the characteristics of ET contact, not contact with other interdimensionals, but the ET contact itself. There are certain characteristics that people have who have had this kind of contact. And, you know, it's an amazing thing. The reason I became a QHHT, quantum healing hypnosis therapist, is that Dolores Cannon, who developed this kind of hypnosis, had hypnotized many, many experiencers. And it was QHHT is a kind of past life regression. So you do a past life regression. And the funny thing is, time and time again, you find out that the experiencer was also having experiences in a past lifetime, or might have even been an extraterrestrial in a past lifetime and is back visiting family.
The oneness. It always comes back to the oneness.
Yes. Yes.
How can people have a session with you? Are you actively doing sessions?
Yes, I am. And you go to my website under, at the top of my page on the menu, you will see Hypnosis with Kathleen. Click on that. You'll read what it's about, and you'll read how they can contact with me, or they can just write to me at Marden, M-A-R-D-E-N, at AOL.com.
Amazing. Amazing. So have you heard of any reports where people had experiences where like a whole neighborhood was had the same experience at the same time, and they were all had something pointed at them so they didn't remember? Anything like that?
Well, I don't know about something pointed at them so they wouldn't remember, but I have certainly heard of groups of people being taken together, and either a neighborhood or people on a beach or people at a UFO conference.
Wow. Wow. That's a little bit surrealistic, right? Wait, is this real? Wait, where?
Kathleen, this has been fascinating. I'm so glad you were able to join us for this.
Thank you.
You're always a font of amazing information from real research, not just kind of an armchair thing, but you've really been beating the street, as it were, to get this kind of information. And so really grateful that we had time to spend with you. Is there anything else you want to leave with us? Did we miss anything as far as your books or anything you're doing or any projects?
Well, I have a number of conferences coming up.
Oh, good.
So if you would like to attend a conference where I will be speaking, they are all listed under on the menu at Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com.
We've got that on the screen, and we've got your books up too. So
okay,
yeah.
And there's a cruise leaving California, San Diego, in October. That should be a lot of fun. There's a conference in Tennessee, the first Alien Expo that they've ever had. I'm going to be at the Alien Con in Los Angeles at the end of June. I'll be in Roswell. I'll be at MUFON Symposium in Irvine, California at the end of July.
You're a busy lady. That's very good.
Yes.
Well, I hope to see you in one or several of those venues. I so want to meet you. And
I hope so too.
Thank you so much for joining us. Tom, you want to take us out?
I shall indeed. Thank you again, Kathleen. Thank you, Nori. This was a great, fascinating interview. And for folks that want more information, again, go to Kathleen's website and check out her books. There's an incredible amount of research, and you'll go down a rabbit hole you will not regret. So with that, we're going to sign out. See you guys. We'll be back on tomorrow evening. So we'll see you folks then. So here we go.